it makes sense that some of those less than ideal elements associated with Halloween would have remained longer because you didn't have something good pushing back against it. There was no singular way to redeem it in a way that was like, this is, bringing in, now we're really celebrating God. We're honoring God in this. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Pastor's Q&A. I'm Pastor Jeremy, this is Pastor Ryan, and we have a question here that says this: is Halloween really a demonic holiday? If so, should we still celebrate it? So, Ryan, why don't you give us a little bit of history on the background of Halloween, where it came from, and help us figure this out.
Yeah, great question. The history of Halloween is really fascinating, especially in contrast to some of the other kind of American Christian holidays that we celebrate, specifically Easter and Christmas. And so there's a lot of debate among historians about some of the roots of Easter, some of the roots of Christmas. Are they founded primarily in Christian tradition, or are they founded are there pagan influences there? And oftentimes what you see is it's a little bit of both, depending on what holiday you're talking about.
Sure.
But with either way, with those specific holidays, with Easter or Resurrection Sunday and Christmas, there is a very significant sort of Christianizing influence throughout history that really made those holidays the ones that we often celebrate in the church. Christmas celebrating Jesus' birth, and Easter or Resurrection Sunday celebrating the resurrection, obviously. But with Halloween, that's really different. Halloween is basically universally recognized by historians as having pagan roots. There was no Christian influence at the beginning. And some of that came a little bit later, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when it started out, it wasn't that way at all. Harold Myra, he was the president of Christianity Today for over 30 years. And here's what he says about Halloween. He says, Halloween's unsavory beginnings preceded Christ's birth with the Druids in what is now Britain and France. They observed the end of summer with sacrifices to the gods. It was the beginning of the Celtic year, and they believed that Samhain, the Lord of Death, sent evil spirits abroad to attack humans who could escape only by assuming disguises and looking like evil spirits themselves. And Myra goes on to summarize. He says, most of our Halloween practices can be traced back to the old pagan rites and superstitions.
So Samhain wasn't the most clever
No,
of evil entities.
Apparently not. Yeah, if somebody was wearing a mask, it really freaked them out, and so they took off. And so there was, as you advance a little bit through history, like I mentioned, there were some different influences, primarily by the Catholic Church, or what was going to kind of become the Catholic Church, to Christianize Halloween, or Christianize this festival celebrating the beginning of winter and the season of darkness. And so a few different ways that took place. One was in the year 609. That is when the Pope at the time, he created All Saints' Day, which took place on November 1st. And so, and this is actually where we get the name Halloween. And so this is one of the kind of enduring Christian principles of it. And so the word hallow we often use to refer to holiness. We pray in the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name. And that's as an adjective. But as a noun, hallow really means saint. And so All Saints' Day, All Hallows' Day. And so Halloween was All Hallows' Eve, All Saints' Eve, in connection to All Saints' Day. And so that's where we get the English term Halloween.
Okay.
And then later on, in the year 835, Pope Gregory III, he was the one who ruled that All Saints' Day fell on Samhain. And so he connected All Saints' Day to Halloween to be the day that we will actually celebrate All Saints' Day. And this is really interesting when it comes to some of the modern practices of Halloween. The other thing that he did was the Pope said that young men could go door to door to collect food for the poor on that day, and villagers could dress up in costumes of the saints to celebrate Samhain, which was now All Saints' Day, and he was transforming it.
Okay.
And so those practices already existed in different pagan forms, but this was Pope Gregory III's attempt to Christianize it a little bit. And
Okay,
make it
so
a
it
little
was
bit
a
more palatable.
direct, in terms of the name Halloween, it is a direct attempt to try to go, okay, they're already celebrating
Hmm.
something on this day, but we don't like what they're celebrating. Let's
Yeah,
displace that celebration with something that is, redeemed in some way, or
exactly.
they're
Yeah.
in some way, but
Yeah,
redeemed. It's obviously an
what they
odd
tried to do to redeem it.
was
Yeah,
odd, yeah.
yeah, and that's what one of the things that sets Halloween apart from even Christmas and Easter is there was a much more thorough sort of redemption of any of the pagan roots of those holidays, and now we celebrate. Many churches celebrate Easter and Christmas or Resurrection Sunday and Advent season. But with Halloween, it was interesting because it was the Pope's attempt to Christianize it, but with some pretty actually unbiblical practices,
Okay.
praying to the dead and doing different things in connection to dead saints and
Yeah.
praising Mary and all these different things. And so it was a kind of a only partially successful attempt to Christianize it, to Christianize the Halloween
'Cause
festival.
that was in 1609. So this is well after.
Yeah, that was
that
so
was when they.
835 is when the Pope ruled All Saints' Day fell on Samhain and made those changes.
That was in
and said to people-
835.
Yeah,
But what happened in 1609? What was that part?
1609. Oh, 609 is when All Saints' Day began.
Oh, okay.
And so that's when the current Pope.
Oh,
and
so it
that
wasn't
was even
1609,
earlier.
it was 609.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
great.
that's right. And then 835 is when that happened, and it really transformed some different practices that already existed. So one thing that was done for the Samhain festival was it was surrounding this great bonfire that they would burn to the gods or to Samhain, the Lord of Death, or to these different evil entities. And so people would go around. Kids would often go around to collect materials, firewood, or different things that they could bring to that bonfire so that they could burn it to their gods. And so Pope Gregory transformed that to say, well, let's collect food for the poor instead. And people would often dress up in these costumes, these evil entities take on the form themselves so that they would sort of trick these evil entities. Because the way it worked is the Druids believed, and ancient Celts believed, that on Halloween, on October 31st, because we were entering into the winter, the season of darkness, they thought that that was the time when the veil between the physical realm and the spiritual realm was at its thinnest.
Okay.
And so that was a time when evil spirits would be able to come onto the earth and they would meddle. They would, the classic poltergeist example, they would be the noisy ghosts. They would mess with different people. And so a couple things would happen. Either you could dress up in a costume to kind of trick them into thinking that you're not a normal human, or you could put out treats for them. And so literally it was a trick. You would either get tricked by these demons or these evil spirits, or you could put out treats for them and give them treats. And so that's
Okay.
where we get the term trick or treat, is you
Comes
had to
from
choose.
that directly.
Yeah, you
Okay.
had to choose. Are you going to get tricked by these evil spirits, or are you going to give them treats? And so people would set out different food items,
Interesting.
treats, all that different stuff.
And so
And
this is all pre-609.
that was yes, that was
Okay.
all pre All Saints Day.
Okay.
And then the church infused these ideas of praying to the dead, and instead of dressing up as evil spirits, let's dress up as dead saints instead. That might be just as creepy depending on what costume you go with. I don't know.
yeah.
But that was the attempted Christianization of it there. And so as you continue on, obviously America gets founded, and it wasn't until the 1800s there was a big influx of Irish immigrants, and Ireland is the only country in Europe that actually has Halloween as a set-apart national holiday.
Still to this
Still,
day.
yeah, to
Okay.
this day. And so you can see that residing Druid or Celtic influence there in Northern Europe especially. And so when we had this big influx of Irish immigrants in the 1800s, that's what really brought Halloween back. The Puritans, they didn't want anything to do. They didn't celebrate it.
Well, that was my question I had, is that
Yeah.
if, with the timeline, if it's 609, that All Hallows Eve actually, or All Saints Day becomes
Mm-hmm.
a thing, and it was 835 or around there, that's when All Hallows Eve became a unique celebration, tried to Christianize it. What was during the Reformation? How did the Reformed Church approach that? Because that would have been obviously many years later. Was the practice of Halloween as described or as instituted by the Pope, was that still in practice at the time of the Reformation? And was that one of the things they said, hey, we don't want any part of that? Or how did that play out?
Yeah, so far as I know, it was. I didn't look specifically at how Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, some of the reformers dealt with it, but I know that was a big part of Luther's 95 Theses was the indulgences for the dead. And so anything to do with the church praying to the dead, they said, no, we pray only to God. And so they really distanced themselves from that. And then what you do see very strongly is the Puritans one of the things that they were trying to escape was practices like that, and Halloween by extension. And so
Yeah.
when America was founded, Halloween was not celebrated. It just wasn't a thing. It was on nobody's minds
Because
until
that was one
the
of the many
1800s.
things that got thrown out. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. With everything else, specifically because of its connection to the dead and to Mary. And so that was thrown out, but then brought back in with that fresh
Irish
influx
influx.
of
So many years
Irish
later.
immigrants.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
And then what happened is, in connection to the church, is there really at the time, even though that was brought back in, it was such a time of sort of Christian cultural dominance that the idea of paganism was so far in the background. There just weren't any pagans the way that we would, sort of occultish, Wiccan pagans,
Small
as we
minority,
would
I would
understand it.
imagine,
Yeah,
yeah.
and so it became it transformed from this druidic rite ceremony to a party night. And so it became a party night when these Irish immigrants brought this in, and then it stayed that way, obviously, for over 100 years. And it's still, to some extent, that way today. It's obviously a big party, and it's one of the biggest, it is the biggest party night of the year, actually, is Halloween, commercially. And so it's interesting, but one
Really,
thing...
the biggest, even bigger than like New Year's Eve or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's that's what I read.
Yeah, wow.
Huge party night. And so one thing that's interesting, though, is as you get closer to the modern era, and we've seen this culturally, obviously, that Christian cultural dominance really begins to wane. It really begins to pull back. And so one of the effects of that is even within the last 20, 30, 40 years, there was a rise of this sort of neo-paganism, or this new paganism. And one of the things that did is these neo-pagans really wanted to take back Halloween. They want to take it back to its druidic roots and celebrate it as Samhain. And so in some people today, a growing number of people actually celebrate Halloween as Samhain, as the ancient druidic festival. They try to take it back almost in a similar way as some Christians want to take back Christmas. We're going to take back Christmas. Well, pagans want to take back Halloween. And there's a growing number of this sort of neo-pagan movement that does that. And you see that even in the commercialization of Halloween. And so with different things that are offered and just different things that companies are doing to make money. And so...
Well, let me a question on that. So you mentioned the last 20 or 30 years is when they really wanted to kind of take the occultic groups and wanted
and
to
it
take
goes
the
back
occult,
farther than that.
because,
It's just sort
when
of
I was
accelerated.
a kid, as far as I can remember, in my lifetime, costumes were scary. There'd be scary costumes. When did that become a thing, in at least the American context, that you wouldn't just, because you mentioned it was a party kind of night, but what about the dressing up? Was that always attached with it, and specifically dressing up as something scary? Was it, I don't know, was it attached to scary movies in the 20s, 30s kind of thing? Because Frankenstein, Dracula, that sort of thing, or do you know the answer to that?
I think that the costumes came over with that big, fresh influx in the 1800s. But one thing that's interesting is there always has been a connection. I think movies accelerated this, but there was always a connection with Halloween and ghost stories.
Okay.
And part of that is the connection to the dead, right? And so there's the dead and just our own psychological fascinations. We are fascinated with scary things, with creepy things.
Sure.
There's something in the adrenaline and in the adrenal glands that
can't
gets
look
fired.
away kind of thing. Yeah.
And so it was always in connection to ghost stories. And so way back, ghost stories would be told in the 1800s. In America, ghost stories would be told in connection to that.
Okay.
And so there was always a creepy element. It was never sufficiently... That was never gone completely. That was never sufficiently
in the practice, even
done
as
away
much
with.
as they tried to Christianize it, that always
exactly. That
and
always
again, when we
remained.
say Christianize it, we mean in an unbiblical way.
Yes, we don't
Whereas,
mean
as
redeem it.
opposed to Christmas and Easter, we're saying, hey, we want to replace this by celebrating the birth of Christ, which is uncontroversial.
Very biblical thing.
They celebrated the birth of Christ, the incarnation, and obviously
Christmas
the resurrection.
Is uncontroversial, but that aspect of it
from a Christian theological standpoint, the
Uh-huh.
idea that, hey, we want to celebrate the incarnation and remember what Christ did for us in that way, or the resurrection, remembering what Christ did for us in that way. But that element was never a part of Halloween because it seemed a bit bizarre. The only thing that I've heard, at least in this conversation, was, hey, let's get food for the poor or something. I mean, obviously that's a nice thing to do, but to do it
Yeah.
on a day where the veneer is thinner and
Yeah.
we're tricking and treating and all
Seems
that
like
is
a
a little
bad
bit
call.
bizarre. Yeah. So anyway, my point is that it makes sense that some of those less than ideal elements associated with Halloween would have remained longer because you didn't have something good pushing back against it. There was
Right.
no
Yeah.
singular way to redeem it in a way that was like, this is, bringing in. Now we're really celebrating God. We're honoring God in this. It doesn't seem
Yeah.
like any of the attempts were really sufficient because they went in an
Exactly,
umbilical
yeah.
direction.
I think
Yeah.
that's exactly right. I think it could have been more successful if they had tried to promote a different influence. I don't know what that would have been because of the roots and because I think that the church was kind of doing the best they could, and it wasn't
How do you do
with
that?
unbiblical principles, and so it wasn't sufficient. So, anyways, all that to say, what does that mean for Christians? What does that mean?
Yeah,
for
what do we
us
do today?
I think number one, I think understanding the history of it is important. I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's significant. Understand what it is that you are participating in when you participate in Halloween. It's important to understand those roots. It's important to understand church history in connection to that. Number two, there's really a few different ways that Christian families approach it. One would be to, yes, still do Halloween, but stay away from the things that are clearly off limits. And so there are things in Scripture that are clearly off limits for the believer. And so an example of this would be found in Deuteronomy 18 here. It says, "There shall not be found among you anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens or a sorcerer or a charmer or a medium or a necromancer or one who inquires of the dead." And so I think if Christian parents, if your kids are trying to do that, that's a no-go. We should not be doing that.
Or even making fun with that. Not
Exactly,
literally
yeah.
trying to do it, but saying, ooh, that's,
Exactly.
you don't want to dabble in that.
Yeah, and you actually see it in the New Testament. There's a verse that says, "Don't imitate evil. Don't be imitators of evil."
Yeah.
And literally, what the Greek means there is, don't even pretend. Don't even pretend to be evil. And so there's a level of darkness that we should not participate in. And I mentioned the commercialization earlier. I remember a few years back when Hasbro, the famous toy company, their CEO just passed away actually, but the Hasbro released an actual Ouija board for ages 5+. And so it's for kids, or maybe it's 8+. They at least gave us that. But anyways, and so this Ouija board for kids to buy and just play around with, just experiment with.
Yeah.
And so that would be an example of something that is off limits for all believers. But from there might be some Christian parents might choose to still do Halloween, have the kids dress up as a fireman or something fairly innocuous, or they might choose an alternative. The churches often will do harvest parties or do fall festivals. We were just at a fall festival for a co-op a few days ago, and it was great. There weren't even costumes. It was just there were bounce houses and just fun games that we got to do as a fall festival, not even in connection to Halloween necessarily. And so that might be an option as well. Or, of course, there would be an option just to abstain completely and just do that. And so in that sense, there are some aspects of potential ways to participate in Halloween that fall in the area of Christian liberty. And so what would you say, Jeremy, about what Christian liberty could look like in the celebration or in potential participation of Halloween without participating in the darkness itself?
Good question. Knowing what we know about the history and such, and how do we engage? I think Romans 14 is helpful because Romans 14 is all about how do Christians interact with one another as it relates to things that are disputable. So as you already expressed, there's some things that are obviously off limits, and we need to help one another in that path of avoiding things that are obviously sinful or dishonoring God in obvious ways. Now, though, there's degrees. Everyone draws a line of, or makes a decision about, no, I think this is off limits, or this would be the best way to go about it. And Romans 14 talks about, do you participate in consuming food sacrificed to idols? And he recognizes that some choose to say, no, I won't touch it, and others say, no, I'll eat it. And the key, he says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats. So basically, you're not condemning the person who's choosing differently than you in an area that is disputable. But the kicker is this. It's not, because in a postmodern world, I think it'd be easy for us to say, well, yeah, man, you got your truth, I've got mine, so don't bother people. That is not the Christian worldview. That is not what the Bible teaches. That's not what Paul is saying here. He's saying this. Yes, there's obvious things that we should not do, but everyone should become convinced in his own mind, he says later in the passage. And with the reason why we don't pass judgment or look down upon people who are going about it differently than us is we recognize that they're all doing it to honor the Lord. So that's an important thing to recognize. So as you're a parent or you're a person saying, how do I engage in this cultural holiday called Halloween that many people are caught up in every October 31st, how can I participate in such a way that I'm honoring the Lord? I think that's what is a good guiding principle to inform our actions. Now, in the pursuit of saying, I'm going to honor the Lord, recognizing people are going to take different avenues.
Right.
For example, like someone might say, I'm going to honor the Lord by saying, me and my family, we're not going to participate in any of that. We don't want to dabble in anything that even smells of darkness, or even it isn't. We're going to honor the Lord with that decision. Okay. Now, it would be wrong for that same person to argue with, or look down upon and cast judgment and yell at, literally, or whatever, someone who's not doing the same thing you are doing. Now, but they're honoring the Lord and trying to say, I want to not do this. And so you want to honor the Lord in the way you interact with other people as well. I think that's key. But also you might say, hey, this is there's kids coming to my door. There's the neighborhood is engaged in this fun activity. How can I honor the Lord in the way I engage with those kids? And so choosing not to engage might be for some a way to honor the Lord, but choosing to try to find a way to engage in them in a way that is good, a way that is a good witness of Christ in some way, shape, or form, is a way to honor the Lord. And so there's different ways you can go about doing that.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that really brings us into the question of, well, what are some ways that we can honor the Lord during that time of Halloween with our kids as we're shepherding them and trying to help them? And a couple things that come to mind. One is, I think that Halloween, and it was Russell Moore, I think, who was talking about this. He said Halloween was his favorite holiday, at least growing up. And he said that one of the reasons why is because it felt like that was the one day of the year where adults really took spiritual realities seriously. And so he said, we recognize demonic forces, we recognize spiritual realities for what they are. Scary. They are real. They are powerful. And we don't have to be afraid, because greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world. And so I think even using that time to help our kids understand, okay, it might be fun to dress up, it might be fun to get candy, but we also need to recognize we don't struggle against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, and we need the armor of God. And so recognize the recognition of spiritual realities, I think, is one way.
So that opens up opportunity, because if you're saying, how am I honoring God in my decision, especially as it relates to kids, I think is where Christians often say, how do you handle this in the context of your kids, right?
Exactly,
What I like about that is that's a way to have a meaningful conversation that disciples your kids.
Exactly,
right?
And that's what you want to do. I think a big part of it is intentionality. Like we talked about earlier, be intentional about knowing the history of Halloween, be intentional about its attempted Christianization, be informed about all those different things, and have those intentional conversations with your kids. And so I think that's one big way that we can redeem the time, so to speak. And then also thinking about, like you mentioned earlier, what does this do to our witness? What does it look like? We're called to love our neighbors. We're called to share the gospel with our neighbors. And this is the one day out of the year where our neighbors literally come to our door. And so how can we redeem the time? How can we use that as an opportunity to love our neighbors? And I'm not saying there's an answer there. That's why it falls in the area of Christian liberty. But we need to ask ourselves, what is our witness if either they come to our house and there's demons and these scary, terrible things that we're using to decorate our home, or things that look like we're participating in darkness or being imitators of evil, or if they come to our house and the lights are off, there's nothing there, there's no candy, and there's a sign on the door that says, "Go away, pagans," then what does that do to our witness? And hopefully there's nobody doing either of those things, but somewhere in the middle, using discernment, using the Christian liberty that God has given us, how can we redeem the time and honor God? But that's two things to think through as we think through what that looks like.
Good. Yeah. And yeah, as you seek to, I think not being blasé about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just going, whatever. That we shouldn't be that way about anything as Christians, right? We should be intentional and purposeful in everything. We've been given a great call and charge from our Lord to make disciples of all nations.
That's right.
And that includes our own children. That includes our
Exactly.
neighborhood. That includes, beyond. And so we should make every decision with the mission Christ has called us to in mind. And so in an area like this, we should be as intentional and as serious and as thoughtful about how we go about it as any other. And one area that I think it would be good for Christians in particular to walk in wisdom and understanding their witness is how you interact with one another. So if you can do a lot of evil in your attempt to stand up for what is good. Or what you think is good.
Yeah, that's right.
I remember Dean Sherman, a guy who wrote a book on spiritual authority or spiritual warfare and that kind of stuff years ago. A YWAM guy, really interesting guy. He said he would counsel some churches who were going through a lot of difficulty, like some sort of leadership level, they're having conflict, and either side standing up for something they really think is, we need to die on this hill, we need to die on this hill. And he said, do you realize you're opening up and your stand for doing what you think is good, you're opening up all kinds of demonic activity into your church in the way that you're handling this dispute.
Yeah.
And I think that's very true. And so it'd be very ironic for us to invite demonic activity into our context while we're standing against something we think is demonically influenced, like Halloween, right? So there's a way to invite demonic activity that doesn't look like dressing up like a witch or something.
Yeah. Yep. That's good. Good wisdom. Well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Pastor's Q&A. You can submit questions to us, pastorsqa@gmail.com. You can find more info on our website. Follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, where you can find updated episodes. And we will see you next time.